Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day two of our virtual boot camp. Eric Duncan here again as your MC. Really excited for what I think is going to be a great day two. Starting off with a powerhouse duo to talk about centering families and reimagining education. And then we're fortunate to have two breakout sessions today, followed by some state team time, and then a quick shout out to some of the states that have done really amazing work over the past year plus. So really excited for you all to be here. Excited to connect with you uh, and continue to learn with you as we plan for the next year plus. Uh, uh, Love to see the activity in the chat. We had a prompt, basically just if you have any takeaways from yesterday, we'd love to see you active in the chat and sharing those with us. Got already some really good feedback about our tutoring recommendations, and of course the student performance from our group from the NOLA. So we again just so happy to be back and really excited about today. I think it's just going to be a great day. Um, Again, make sure you are active in the chat. That you, if you have questions, concerns, that you reach out to us and continue to connect with one another. I had a really good time yesterday connecting with folks from across the country, from California, from New York, from really all over the country, which is a testament to the wide range of folks. We Detroit, you guys got to chill. I mean, come on. Uh, but we're again. Please connect. Not a chance, of course not. Please continue to use the chat, connect, and again, we're super excited about today. I'm going to kick us off real quick. We have, again, like I said, two powerhouses in education that we're really excited to bring to you. And both of these folks have extensive backgrounds, have done so much in education to support students and try to close the opportunity gaps that we all care deeply about impacting. And so I am super excited. Oh, and welcome from Atlanta as well. I'm in Atlanta. So, but super excited to introduce these two speakers to open our discussion and lead us into the plenaries, or excuse me, the breakout sessions that we're going to engage in. So, introducing first Dr. John B. King, who probably doesn't need an introduction. I mean, he's our president and CEO, former U.S. Secretary of Education, has just done so much as a leader and as a leader of color in particular in setting the stage for the way that we address educational inequities, and has again such an extensive background as U.S. Secretary of Ed, as a U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education, as a former high school teacher and principal. Just an extensive story and an incredible story that I encourage you all to investigate. So he's going to be joined in a discussion with Dr. Karen Mapp, who I'm also really thrilled to introduce you to. She also has an extensive background. She currently is a senior lecturer on education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the faculty director of the Education Policy and Management Master's Program. I think there was a question in the chat yesterday about a woman who has really led in producing great research. And so we tried to bring her to you to get her insights, but encourage you to investigate her background even further and some of her research. Her research and practice focuses on the cultivation of partnerships among families, community members, and educators that support student achievement and school improvement. Before her work at Harvard, she served as a consultant on family engagement to the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, in the Office of Innovation and Improvement. She was a deputy superintendent for family and community engagement for Boston Public Schools. So again, an extensive background, well-versed, extremely knowledgeable, And so I'm really excited to turn it over to these two to lead our discussion and open the day.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm excited for the conversation with Karen today, and just want to frame our conversation by acknowledging the multiple challenges that families have been struggling with over the last year. And that we have to start by acknowledging the impact that COVID has had on kids and families, particularly our most vulnerable, particularly low-income families, families of color. Folks have suffered disproportionate health impact of COVID, disproportionate economic impact of COVID. But then alongside COVID and the economic crisis it brought us, we've been grappling as a country with this moment of reckoning with issues of racial justice. And for parents of color, these are not new issues. These are not issues that began with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. Those are part of a continuation of the legacy in our culture of anti-Blackness and of systemic racism. All of us as parents of color know that experience of trying to talk with your children about interactions with police and trying to help them figure out how to navigate those interactions in a way that is safe for them. And also the frustration and fear that we still see these countless incidents of the murder of innocent people of color and interactions with police. We also have been grappling with gun violence. And I know we have folks in the community with us today from Knoxville where they've lost 4 students to gun violence since January. And so we are today talking about parents navigating school, but it's really helping parents navigate all of these challenges that they and their kids face. And there's no better person to help us think about those issues, those challenges, and how we as a community of advocates can support parents and families than Karen Mapp. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Karen. And Karen, maybe I'll ask you to just start with defining for us, what is family engagement and why have you dedicated your life, your work, and your research to trying to strengthen family engagement?
Well, thank you, John. And, before I answer the question, I just want to say that just this week in my class, I teach a family and community engagement course, and I teach it twice in order to honor and respect the different time zones we're now dealing with because we have students from all over the world taking the class. And what we focused on for the first 20 minutes of class this week was on our wellness. Because of all of the trauma, like gun violence that's happened in the communities, like the violence that's happening all over the world. And so one of the things that we really tried to take account of was that we all have to really spend time on our wellness. And so we actually broke up into small groups and shared our own wellness strategies with each other. So I would encourage, I don't know if at some point that your participants have a moment today or tonight or tomorrow, just really take care of yourselves because these are tough moments that we're all going through. And so I just wanted to share that. I also wanted to say on a lighter note that this is turnaround is fair play because I was interviewing John like this in the fall, where I was the moderator and he was the person I was asking questions of. So I only feel it's fair, John, that that we switch roles.
Right.
That's right. That's right. So let me talk about the definition of family engagement and how I define it. Family engagement really is a term that is a placeholder for all of the practices and actions that we take to try to build full, equal, and equitable partnerships between all the adults in a child system, right? And the full, equal, equitable partnership language actually comes from the Connecticut State Department of Education's definition of family engagement. I really like that. So family engaging is moving towards this full, equal, and equitable partnership. And, over the last year, I think we've all had our own moments of reflection and reckoning. And I've been actually thinking about my language around family engagement and the definition. And I like to say, again, family engagement really is all of those practices that lead to these partnerships. But when we look at those practices, those family engagement practices, I've gotten a little bit more intentional about my language, about what those practices have to look like. And the language I'm using now, one of my wonderful doctoral students, Ayal Bergman, and I are writing a piece for the Carnegie Corporation, which is a call to action. And we're talking about our family engagement practices actually have to be liberatory, free of dominance, okay? They have to be solidarity driven, which means they're in union and fellowship with others. And then, of course, equity focus. So, fair and just. So if we use those kinds of family engagement practices, right? Because, right now, we all know that some of our family engagement practices have been ineffective and also, quite frankly, sometimes disrespectful of families and communities. If we use those, if we lean into making sure our family engagement practices are like I just described, then the definition of family engagement becomes robust. It becomes well served. So those full, equal, and equitable partnerships actually happen. Now, those partnerships are in service of student and school improvement, right? That's what the ultimate goal is. So that's the definition I've been working with, but I've really been focusing in on that sort of, it's got to be liberatory practice. It's got to be solidarity-driven practice. It's got to be equity-focused practice around family and community engagement.
Mm-hmm. And, in this moment where, families struggled with internet access and device access, school districts have struggled with supporting families around online or hybrid learning and supporting even their own teachers around hybrid and online learning with the tools that they need, where there's been so much disruption of school. So now as we come back to school and we try to address the gaps that existed before COVID, plus the academic and socio-emotional impact of COVID, how should we think about what the kind of family engagement you're describing should look like with the return to school?
Well, I have found, I have to sort of smile because, John, that I've been working on this for a very long time. We had a chuckle because I remember I said to you, I found an old Palm Pilot. Half of the people on this phone call probably don't remember what a Palm Pilot was. But I think it was back in the early 90s when you and I met, and when you were at Roxbury Prep. And we talked about, what's your family engagement look like here? And, so it's been a long time when we've all been sort of wrestling with what does effective practice look like? Well, the irony is that with the two pandemics, which is what I call, the racial reckoning and the COVID, I think people now are really asking questions about, oh boy, we see that family engagement is really important. Our families we've been in their living rooms, their kitchens. We've had to talk with families now and not just at families. And so now I think for folks who might have been a bit reticent and resistant around really best practices around family engagement, they're now asking, what do we now do? We saw how important engaging with families was over the past year. How do we now maybe not let go of that partnership that we actually entered into, maybe with a little bit of force? We talk about COVID being a forcing function around family engagement, right? So I think now people are ready to have a conversation about how this needs to be elevated. In fact, our friends at Educational Resource Strategies and Brookings, family engagement is now listed as high priority in terms of what we need to put in place when we start back. They're also talking, ERS is talking about how now that districts have these resources coming from the rescue plan, that family engagement should be something they really lean into in terms of strengthening with some of that new money that's coming in. So I do think, John, that we do have some help. You know that I worked with the U.S. Department of Education back in 2013 to publish the Dual Capacity Building Framework for Family School Partnerships, which was designed as guidance for how to do family engagement well. So when you think about, I always like to use the metaphor of a house. We all know that when you're building a house, the inside, the infrastructure has to be strong. And what the dual capacity framework does is provides districts and states with that infrastructure. What are the key components that you have to have in place to have strong, effective, equitable, liberatory family engagement practice? Now, we all know that every house ends up being different in the design elements, right? So that's how the framework fits into the context. So even though we give you the infrastructure, what you add on has to be aligned with your context. So what the house that gets designed for Baltimore family engagement might not be the same as a house that gets designed in Pittsburgh, right? So we give you the core elements of effective practice, but then you add on and make it aligned with what meets the needs of your context.
And if you were going to give advocates an example of, 2 or 3 places that you think either during COVID or even before COVID, we're doing something really smart around family engagement that they should be encouraging their districts or states to try to replicate, what are some examples that you highlight?
Well, what's been nice over the past couple of years, and especially during COVID, I actually did a webinar series this summer because I started asking that very question, John. What does effective practice look like now? And we had a 10-part webinar series where we pulled in people from schools and districts to talk about what they were doing. I will tell you, quite honestly, that the systems and the schools and the classrooms who had already started building effective practice, particularly around building relationships of trust and respect with families, they all told me they had a much easier time pivoting during COVID. So they didn't see, the drops in attendance. Some of them actually saw, quite frankly, some gains in some areas because they already had those strong partnerships between home and school. In fact, one of the schools that I always talk about as a wonderful example is the Learning Community School in Rhode Island. This is a charter school, which actually a part of their DNA is around family school partnerships. And, they said that, everybody stepped into place. And I'll tell you a quick story that just shows you a little bit about the culture of the school. This is a school that is mostly serves immigrant families. All the families are free, reduced lunch. When the first stimulus checks came in, some of the families called the co-director and said, we'd like to give our stimulus checks to other families that may need it more than we do. So that tells you a little bit about this school. And remember, I said all families qualify for free and reduced lunch, right? And families then said, what can we do? Let's pitch in with the teachers. And they worked together to really support the community there in Rhode Island. So that's a school. But then I would say I'm pleased that districts now, we have some districts that are actually doing some wonderful systemic work around family engagement. One of our wonderful graduates from the Ed School, Sade Harris, is in Richmond, Virginia. And I know that she's gonna probably be mad at me because everybody's gonna be calling her up, but she's doing some amazing work on providing this wonderful systemic infrastructure around family engagement. She told me a story about and she actually reports directly to the superintendent, which I think is important because she's there when they're having conversations about teaching and learning, because family engagement should be embedded in our teaching and learning practice, right? And she said what she's done as a part of her family and community engagement staff, not only has she hired family liaisons who are community partners, but she's hired something, I think she called it a housing navigator. And this is a person, because we all know that, as you said at the beginning of your remarks, all of these crises connect with one another. So when we've got parents that are homeless, that has an impact in their children's schooling. So she has a housing navigator that helps her homeless families find permanent homes, so that their children aren't missing school, or you see. So that's family engagement. That's equity-focused family engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I do think that we're seeing lots of good work all over Nashville. We have a district leaders network, which is a lot of the people who are in these roles like Sade's, who come together. The Institute for Educational Leadership brings them together to share best practice. Baltimore with Sonia Santalese. You have Philly that's doing some wonderful work. So I have to admit, I'm excited and optimistic about where we're going in the field of family and community engagement.
That's encouraging. I mean, it's important to have those examples. I'm curious, and you and I have talked about this in the past, that this moment of reckoning around issues of racial justice, we've heard from a lot of school districts pledges that they believe Black Lives Matter, that they're in solidarity with the movement for racial justice. But I'm not sure always the actions have matched the rhetoric. To your mind, what should a school district that is serious about taking on racial equity, what kinds of things should they be doing? And in particular, how should they be engaging families in that work?
Well, I think about my wonderful House of Representative member, Ayanna Pressley, who talks a lot about, nothing about us without us, right? And I think that through the wonderful work of Dr. Ann Ishimaro, she's really pushing concepts of co-design. So if we're really thinking about sort of that solidarity-driven part of engagement, is our families need to be at the table when we're making these decisions. And I think that's kind of the hardest part. That's going to be the part where we're really going to have to see a reframing of how we think about our work as educators. We're very used to basically speaking to the community, talking at the community, even those of us that are well-intentioned, right? See, this is the thing. I mean, I myself have to constantly remind myself and ask myself, am I really doing solidarity-driven practice when I only do a focus group, but I don't really have families in decision-making roles sitting at the table where the decisions are made? So I do think that that's what I'm looking for now, and that's what I'm really pressing a lot of our school districts. If they talk about they are really want to lean into sort of this racial equity, they've got to make sure that the community and families are at the table, that they set the table for our families and community members, because that's the other thing. Sometimes, they'll be invited to the table, but when they get there, the reception isn't all that warm, and there aren't structures put in place so that people can be actively participating. So one of the things that Ann Ishimaro talks about is, how do you set a co-design table? It's one thing to ask people to do it. It's another thing to give them the supports and practices that they do it well, because we haven't been taught how to do that well. And so I think that we have to really think about what we got to look, Ibram Kendi always talks about, right? It's the policies and the systems and the structures that sometimes create barriers for those of us who are really well-intentioned to actually walk the walk and not just talk it. Right.
So we've got, joining us today, all these advocates who are working at the state and local level to put pressure on folks, sometimes encouraging, sometimes asking, sometimes pushing, sometimes demanding that folks adopt policies that are equity advancing. If you were to advise all all of the advocates who are with us today, what kinds of policy changes should they be seeking from their, let's say, their state commissioner of education or their state board of education or their state legislators?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to think about, and this is where the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement has been really instrumental in working with our states. And I think right now, as we speak, they're working on a proposal to the US DOE around establishing an office for family and community engagement at the federal level. I think there's a number of policies that we have to examine. First of all, there's a lot of policies that really restrict the resources and time our educators can spend on family engagement work. So at the district level and the state level, how do we work with our unions on figuring out how much time we're actually going to allow our educators to engage in the practice of family engagement, right? I also think that the supports need to be intentional. How do we support educators in this practice? Because as you said, it's one thing to tell people to go forth and do this work. But if you don't provide them with the support and the resources so that they can change their routines and that they can be coached and that they can get professional development on an ongoing basis, not just a one and done on family engagement. We're not going to change our practice unless we have a chance to get coached and have a chance to, fail forward and then get coaching on what we can do differently. So I think any policies that look at things like professional development, I would like to see accreditation policies shift so that they include something around proficiency in family and community engagement, right? Because quite frankly, what gets measured gets paid attention to, what gets evaluated gets paid attention to. But if you're going to do that, you also have to make sure you provide the supports. Our late friend and colleague, Richard Elmore, he always taught us, for every unit of change you expect, you have to provide an equal unit of support. So it can't just be that we, change the accreditation standards and say, you must be proficient in family engagement without then providing some, technical assistance and professional development support for people to be able to recraft their practice around family engagement. So any of the policies that can impact those pieces, I think would be really important to take a look at and to lean into.
That's great. Let me encourage folks to put questions in the chat. We have a few more minutes, so folks should share those questions. While people are populating the chat, let me ask you specifically about English learners and the broader question of families for whom English is not the language they speak at home. What are you seeing around the country that's encouraging about how schools are building connections and providing supports to those families?
Well, I think that, again, the learning community is a really good example of that. And that when, they're very intentional about hiring staff, both teachers and their support staff, who are either from the community or have at least some sort of familiarity with those communities. I do think it's the same, we talk about with, trying to cultivate and get more Black and Brown teachers into our schools. I think that's got to be a real focus, because when you have people from the community or who have some affinity with those communities, it's a lot easier for families to feel included and welcomed. But that doesn't leave our white majority colleagues off the hook, right? It does mean that, Bettina Love talks about, you have to get to know your families and your communities. You have to get to know their values, their cultures. And so I do think that, that also is required, especially in our communities that have, large immigrant populations. I've tried my best to, I don't speak fluent Spanish, but I've learned enough so that I can at least get by. I can at least tell my families, a few things and then maybe get some support and help. The other thing is that a lot of our schools, I think, sometimes don't leverage the community-based organizations that might be around them, the churches, the faith-based organizations that have strong connections with families. Looking for those partnerships in the various communities, I think, can be very, very helpful. Even, you'd be surprised. We have a number of bodegas and hair salons in the Latinx community here in Boston, and the school department, the family engagement group, at one time really connected with them, and they provided a lot of supports for activities, translation, but also actually places to meet in the community where families felt more comfortable. Because unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, one of my colleagues, Sue Hung, has written a wonderful book called Natural Allies, and she talks about how, especially for some of our immigrant families, they've experienced generational trauma with our education system. And so you really, in terms of building relationships, may have to go to partners who those families trust, who could be the broker between home and school to start that relationship.
Sure. I know we're at time, but there's a question in the chat that I want to make sure I ask you to touch on. Judith Bradley asks about students with disabilities and supporting their families. One of the things we've seen in our polling that we've done at EdTrust is how stressful this period has been for parents of students with disabilities, and how frequently their students have not been getting services consistently during this period. How would you encourage school districts, states to be thinking about the right supports and relationship building with families of students with disabilities?
Well, I do think, John, unfortunately, what I've seen is that, again, a lot of times those families, again, this sort of goes back, and I don't want to be glib about it, but the nothing about us without us applies to our families with disabilities as well. And, what we did in Boston when I was deputy superintendent, we worked pretty closely with the Special Needs Pact, and brought, what I had found was the relationship with that group before was one that was filled with tension around always fearing some sort of litigation. Instead of us sitting down and talking about, okay, what are the resources that we need to be sharing with each other so that families know their rights and know what's available. And I do think that has to happen now, is to sit down with families to say what worked, what didn't work, how can we be better, how can we engage in a partnership that's more about reciprocity, sharing information. Those families know their children very well. They saw what their families responded to well and what their children did not respond to. And guess what? That is valuable information for going forward. I was actually in a conversation with some students. Well, I wasn't in a conversation. I was listening to them. And they asked their teachers, this was on a Zoom call, these are high school students that asked their teachers, what did you learn about how to teach us differently during COVID? I think I mentioned that to you, right?
I love that.
And that was a moment that was like, whoa. And I think that that's a question that we can engage with all our families, whether it's EL families, families with children with disabilities. Like, what have we learned during this period about how we should be teaching differently? And having a conversation where we get a chance to be vulnerable with one another. Again, I think sometimes we get our shoulders up and we get defensive. And, the disability community, when I think about those kids and what this year has done, I mean, their families, I've had conversations with their families about what they even learned about what their children could and could not respond to. And that information needs to be shared and appreciated.
That's right. I could talk to you all day.
One of these days we have to make an arrangement where we can talk for longer than 30 minutes.
Exactly. But I just want to thank you again for being a part of this conversation and sharing so much wisdom and insight with us. I feel like anytime I get to spend with you, I walk away from the conversation smarter, and also just humbled by your passion and dedication to lifting up family engagement. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all the participants. Wish I could see you all in person. Look forward to when that is possible. And we'll turn it back to Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. We could listen to that all day. So nothing about us without us. I mean, so powerful and so true. So let's get to work. We have about 5 more minutes before our first set of breakout sessions. So take a stretch break, do what you need to do. Once the session closes out, you'll be able to hit the back button to the agenda, which will show you the list of breakout sessions that you'll be able to choose from at 1:40. And then we have another set right after state time. And then I will see you all back here at 4:30. Incredible way to start the day, and look forward to connecting with you a little later. Take care.